안녕하세요. 반갑습니다. 지금 계속 들어오고 계신데요. 4시 이제 시작 시간이 되어서 오늘 행사를 진행하겠습니다. 오늘 행사는 질 들뢰즈의 사변적 실제론의 한국어판 출간을 기념하는 저자 아연 클라인헤이런브링크 전 지구 인터넷 화상 강연입니다. 강연 제목은 들뢰즈주의적 실제론, Deleuzian Realism입니다. 저는 오늘 진행을 맡은 추희정입니다. 현재 다중지성의 정원에서 함께 공부를 하고 있습니다. 먼저 진행에 관한 몇 가지 공지를 드리겠습니다. 오늘 행사는 1부와 2부로 나눠서 진행을 합니다. 1부는 약 50분간 아연 클라인헤이런브링크의 강연이 있겠고요. 강연 후에 약 10분간 휴식 시간을 갖겠습니다. 그리고 이어지는 2부에는 약 1시간가량 질의응답 및 토론 시간을 갖겠습니다. 질문은 사전 신청 시에 미리 받기도 했는데요. 강연을 들으시면서 질문하고 싶으신 내용은 2부 시작할 때 채팅창에 올려주시거나 또는 바로 질문을 하시길 원하시는 경우 발언을 신청해 주시면 2부에 순차적으로 질의응답 시간을 갖겠습니다. 1부 강연 시간에는 미리 메일로 보내드린 강연문을 참고해 주시기 바랍니다. 오늘 강연문의 번역은 이 책의 역자이신 김효진 선생님께서 해주셨습니다. 강연 시간 동안에 보내드린 번역문이 화면에 공유됩니다. 클라인헤이런브링크님의 강연 속도에 맞추어서 현재 낭독되고 있는 부분이 어디인지 커서로 화면에 표시해드릴 예정입니다. 그리고 강연 시간 동안에는 원활한 진행을 위해서 강연자 그리고 사회자 통역자를 제외하고 입장하신 분들은 모두 음소거 상태입니다. 양해를 부탁드리겠습니다. 그럼 오늘의 강연자인 아연 클라인헤이런브링크님을 간략하게 소개해드리겠습니다. 네덜란드 아펠도른 출신의 철학자이며 현재 네이메헌 소재 라드바우드대학교에서 철학, 신학, 종교학과 조교수로 재직하고 있습니다. 주로 대륙 철학적 전통에서 형이상학과 철학적 인간학을 연구하면서 인간에게 특권적 지위를 부여하지 않고 인간을 사물들 사이에서 동등한 존재자로 여기는 사상에 큰 관심을 가지고 있습니다. 2016년에 라드바우드 대학교에서 Machine Philosophy, Gilles Deleuze and the Externality of Entities라는 논문으로 박사 학위를 취득했습니다. 그리고 2019년에 그 논문을 수정 증보하여 책을 출간하였는데요. 그 저서의 한국어판이 바로 이 책, 질 들레즈의 사변적 실제론, 연속성에 반대한다입니다. 또한 2019년과 2020년에 들뢰즈 철학의 견지에서 객체지향 존재론을 다룬 논문 The Two Times of Objects와 Metaphysical Primitives를 각각 발표했습니다. 그간의 저서를 통해서 알 수 있듯이 아연 클라인헤이런브링크는 들뢰즈 철학의 깊은 연구를 바탕으로 새로운 관점을 제시해주고 있습니다. 특히 이 저서에서는 들뢰즈를 사변적 실제론의 선구적 철학자로 자리매김하고 있는데요. 존재론의 핵심 요소들을 7명의 관련된 현대 사상가인 레비 브라이언트, 마우리치오 페라리스, 마르코스 가브리엘, 마누엘 데란다, 그레이엄 하먼, 트리스탄 가르시아, 브리노 라뚜르와 비판적으로 비교하고 있는 점도 흥미로운 부분입니다. 오늘 이 시간에는 들뢰즈주의적 실제론이라는 제목으로 사변적 실제론의 선구자로서 들뢰즈 철학의 핵심 요소는 무엇인지에 관해 강연을 해주시겠습니다. 현재 지금 강연자님께서 계신 네덜란드 네이메헌의 시간은 오전 9시 5분인데요. 오늘 이 한국어판 출간 기념 강연회를 위해 특별히 시간 내주신 클라인헤이런브링크 님을 큰 박수로 모셔보겠습니다.
Okay, Arjen, she just asked for a round of applause for everyone and invited you to speak.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy and very honored that the book got translated into Korean, and I'm also very happy to be here. So I'll just start. As you may know, Gilles Deleuze is widely acknowledged as one of the great metaphysicians of the 20th century. But his greatest achievement as a metaphysician is generally considered to be a very specific theory found in Difference et Repetition, Difference and Repetition, which was published in 1968. And I wrote the book Against Continuity because I disagree with this part of Deleuze's reputation. I believe that his best metaphysical theory is not found in Difference and Repetition, but rather in later works, such as The Logic of Sense and further books that he would later co-author with Félix Guattari. And one reason for this belief is that Deleuze himself explicitly distanced himself from Difference and Repetition. In one of the prefaces to The Logic of Sense, which was the next book that he wrote, Deleuze states that the metaphysics of Difference and Repetition was a theory of classical height and archaic depth. And as will be explained during the lecture, when Deleuze says that a theory belongs to the heights or to the depths, he means that it ought to be dismissed, that there is something wrong with it. In that same preface, Deleuze also adds that even though he will keep using some of the same philosophical terminology that he introduced in Difference and Repetition, these terms will have different meanings from the Logic of Sense and onwards. In other words, after Difference and Repetition, Deleuze moved on to a different philosophy. And my claim is therefore that Deleuze is famous for the wrong metaphysics. He is famous for a theory that he rejected very soon after writing it, and the alternative metaphysics that he subsequently designed has not yet received adequate attention. That's the general idea behind the book. So in today's lecture, I would like to do the following. First, I want to give a broad outline of Deleuze's first metaphysics, the initial metaphysics from Difference and Repetition. Second, after explaining why the theory is promising at first sight, I will discuss why it nevertheless falls short on closer inspection. So there's something wrong with it. And this second section is also where I will explain why my book is called Against Continuity. The title has something to do with the problem in Difference and Repetition. Third, I will describe the most important features of the second metaphysics that Deleuze develops after realizing these shortcomings. This is the metaphysics that, as I indicated, has largely been ignored thus far. So to start with the first, the metaphysics in Deleuze's Difference et Repetition. In Difference and Repetition, Deleuze presents a theory according to which all of reality consists of two realms, of two different dimensions. But he uses the term realm quite often. And the names of these realms are famous. First, there's the realm of the actual. The actual realm consists of every individual entity that reality contains according to our ordinary experience and empirical science. It consists of animate as well as inanimate objects, so atoms and molecules, rocks and diamonds, eagles and tigers, rivers and mountains, humans and robots, countries and corporations. All these are actual entities. Second, there is the realm of the virtual. So what are the denizens, the citizens of the virtual realm? Deleuze tells us that they are singularities. Now, what is a singularity? A singularity is a point where qualitative change is produced. For example, everybody knows that 100 degrees Celsius is the point where water is converted into steam, just like 0 degrees Celsius is the point where water is converted into ice. Such a point of conversion is a singularity. So a singularity is a moment of conversion. It's a transformation. Now, please imagine for a moment that in the example of water, you could separate the water from the change that it undergoes at 0 or 100 degrees Celsius. So just like you can isolate the meaning from a written text, imagine that you can isolate change from the water. So imagine that you could put the water in one room and the 2 points of change in another room. The second room would then contain two very peculiar entities. They would not be wet like water. They would not be hot like a temperature. They would be abstract entities. Each of them would just be a change, nothing more and nothing less. This is already very hard to imagine. It is hard to imagine a change completely separated from a thing that is changing. But now let's imagine something even more complicated. Imagine a certain volume of ice that is slowly heated up until we have boiling water. In this case, we do not just have the 2 points of change, where the solid becomes a liquid and the liquid becomes a gas. We also have many ordinary points of change in between. We have the point where 50-degree water is becoming 51-degree water. We have the point where 84-degree water is becoming 85-degree water, and so on. In fact, during this process, we have indefinitely many points of change. And again, let's imagine that we can separate the water itself from all these points of change. So again, let's mentally imagine that we put the water in one room and indefinitely many points of change in another room. Again, these points do not have the kinds of qualities that actual entities like water have. Points of change are not frozen, not wet, not hot, not cold. They are just pure change. Or as Deleuze calls them, they are pure differences. They are pure processes. They are not an actual thing that changes. They are not the water itself. They are the change itself. They are all the singularities that, taken together, account for everything that happens to the water. Now, according to Deleuze, the virtual realm contains such processes for every single actual thing that exists. So not just for water, but also for fire, for humans, robots, diamonds, rocks, countries, corporations, and so on. This metaphysical theory of two realms, actual and virtual, has often been called a peculiar variation on pre-Socratic theories. Remember that the pre-Socratics posited that everything ultimately is a primordial substance, like fire or water. In Difference and Repetition, Deleuze simply proposes a more abstract and more dynamic version of such theories. He proposes that there is an actual world full of individual things, and that below or behind this world, there is a pre-individual realm full of purely transformative points, singularities, and that relations between these singularities account for everything that is created, altered, or destroyed in the actual world. Now, why would somebody ever propose such a metaphysics? The reason is that the virtual realm seems to solve a problem regarding change and causality. In very basic terms, the problem is that change and causality are nowhere to be found in the actual world. Of course, we see that things change everywhere around us all the time, but we cannot isolate change. For example, let's say that I stop going to the barber so that my hair will keep getting longer. And let's say that my hair also starts becoming more gray as I get older. I can isolate different lengths of my hair at different points in time. I can also isolate different colors of my hair at different points in time. I can compare these lengths and these colors to each other to see how I have changed. But I cannot access the change itself. Change itself eludes me. It happens everywhere around me. But whenever I try to isolate it, I'm always too late. I only get some other quality, like a length or like a color. I always get something that is changing, but never change itself. So where does change come from? We do not find it in things, because in things, we just find things that have changed. We never find change itself. That's the first problem. There is a similar problem with causality. In any given chain of events, I can only ever identify the actual thing that caused something. For example, I can identify the cat that knocked over my glass of water. But I can never isolate the cause itself apart from the actual thing. I can never isolate the knocking from the cat that knocks over the glass. In other words, Changes and causes are all around us, but at the same time, they are not properties of actual things in the same way that lengths and colors are properties of actual things. Changes and causes seem to come from between things. Yet no matter how hard we look between things, we never find a change or cause. That's the problem. Now, many philosophies have tried to solve this problem by making one kind of actual entity a privileged entity that is supposed to do all the causal work in reality. An atomist, for example, thinks that all causal work in reality plays out on some kind of microscopic level, and that the macroscopic world of our experience is the series of effects of this molecular world. Likewise, what philosophers call an occasionalist is someone who thinks that all causal work in reality is done by a supernatural God, such that the natural world around us is just the effect of his actions. The problem, as you will easily see, the problem with such theories is that they merely relocate the problem rather than solving it. Logically speaking, their solution is premised on the rule that changes to things on some level of reality must be accounted for on some other level of reality. But if that is the case, and if events in the actual world are accounted for by change in a microscopic world, for example, then we must introduce a third layer of reality, a microscopic world, to account for change in the microscopic world until infinity. Alternatively, if change in the actual world is accounted for by the actions of a God, then we must introduce gods beyond God in order to account for change in God ad infinitum. So as long as you want to account for changes in the actual world by positing some other layer of reality that also consists of things, the same problem simply repeats itself with regards to that layer that you posit, namely, how do those things then change, which necessitates the introduction of another layer, thus triggering an infinite regress. And hence the inventive character of Deleuze's metaphysics in difference and repetition. What accounts for the actual realm is not another realm of things, but a realm consisting of changes themselves. The virtual realm does not contain things. It's a realm of pure processes, a realm of pure causes. The actual realm is not the realm of causes and changes. It's just a realm of effects. So every car, every tree, every sound, and every other existing thing is a product of pure processes in the virtual realm. And the change that we constantly perceive in the actual realm is just a series of states that are produced by pure processes in the virtual realm. The reason why we cannot perceive change in the same way that we perceive length or color is therefore that change simply comes from behind the scenes, so to speak. By analogy, think of it in the following way. Every single thing, every single property of every single thing in actual reality, so everything we see, everything we measure, is akin to a single frame of a movie. To us, the viewers of that movie, it looks like there is causality and change in the projection of the movie itself. For example, you first see a robber pull out a gun in a bank, and next we see a bank employee raising their hands. We think that what we saw first was caused by what we saw second. That what we saw second was caused by what we saw first. This, however, is an illusion. The cinematic content of one frame is not the cause of the appearance of the next frame. Instead, the cause for the actualization of sequences of frames is the projector that diligently works behind the scenes. In Deleuze's early metaphysics, the actual realm is like the projection on the screen. It is the realm about which we, who are deeply immersed in it, believe that it contains causes and changes that connect everything in certain sequences. Conversely, the virtual realm is like the entire machinery of the projector that secretly produces the projection of the film on a screen. It is the real location of causes and changes that combine the images of actual reality into sequences of events. So, why does this metaphysics fail in difference and repetition? Recall that Deleuze abandoned his metaphysics because he thought it still fell prey to problems that he associated with what he calls classical height and archaic depth. So let's try to understand what that means. The key to understanding this is the philosophical principle that relations are external to terms. A term can be anything at all. It can be a tree, a car, a festival, a molecule, a brain, or a bird. So the principle, relations are external to terms, can also be rephrased as things are external to their relations. This principle of exteriority animates Deleuze's thought from his very first book on the Scottish philosopher David Hume, published in 1958, right until his last works from the early 90s. Now, what do things have relations with? First, things have relations with smaller things that are their parts. Second, they have relations with larger things of which they are parts. For example, a human being has relations with countless smaller things that include our nerves, organs, and memories that are all our parts. At the same time, a human being is always itself a functioning part of many larger things, such as languages, cultures, nations, families, and traditions. If we say that a thing is external to its relations, we say that it cannot be reduced to such smaller and larger things. It is to say that even if you had all the facts about a human being's biological and cognitive parts, plus all the facts about all the things of which she is further a part, you still would not have all the facts about that specific human being. That things are external to their relations means that there is more to each thing than just its parts and its environment. And Deleuze always insists that exteriority must be the case. To pretend otherwise is a mistake. To reduce a thing downwards is to reduce it into archaic depth, into its parts. It's to pretend that a thing makes no contribution of its own to reality. It is to pretend that it is just a passive representation of smaller parts that would do all the causal work, all the real causal work. Conversely, to reduce a thing upwards is to reduce it into classical heights. It is again to pretend that a thing does not make its own difference. It is to pretend that a thing is merely a passive result of higher laws or structures that determine its every move. According to Deleuze in the logical sense, a classical way of reducing things downwards is into the depths of pre-Socratic thoughts. A classical way of reducing things downward into the depths is pre-Socratic thought. According to the pre-Socratics, everything ultimately is a certain primordial substance or a combination of such primordial substances. And the classical way of reducing things upwards into the heights is Platonism, insofar as Socrates posits the existence of an eternal heaven of ideas that ultimately accounts for the being of every actually existing thing. But the question is why? Why must things be external to their relations? Why must things be irreducible to their relations? Deleuze gives us various arguments throughout his works, but I will limit my discussion to just two of them. First, if we dissolve things into their relations, if the being of entities would be purely relational, then each entity would be exhausted in its current state of affairs. It would be nothing but how you currently relate to your parts and your environment, and if the same would be true for all those other things that are your parts and that are in your environment, then not a single thing would have the non-relational surplus required to ditch old relations and forge new ones. In other words, if things were internal to their relations, change would be impossible. Second, if we dissolve things into their relations, the particular properties of things become unintelligible, especially insofar as properties can be emergent. An emergent property is a property that is not found among the parts that constitute the thing. For example, water explodes and freezes at different temperatures than the hydrogen and oxygen that are its parts. Hence, things must be external to their relations. Of course, things have relations with their parts, and of course, things have relations with even larger things. But ontologically speaking, every single thing must always be more than its relations with its parts and environment. Not a single thing is therefore just a passive representation of how entities on a lower or higher level function, entities that account for all the differences that the thing would make in reality. Not a single human being, for example, is reducible to the biological parts that constitute her, nor is a single human being ever reducible to the workings of the ideologies that surround her. Now, why does this principle of exteriority invalidate Deleuze's early two-realm metaphysics? The problem is that this metaphysics of an actual and a virtual realm falls prey to what we just covered. Entities in the actual realm are reduced to the virtual realm. According to this earlier theory, cars, trees, rocks, and hurricanes are not causes that make their own difference to reality. They are just effects of pure processes in the virtual realm. They are just passive representations of changes among singularities. But what is a singularity? We saw that a virtual singularity does not have the kind of properties that actual things have. A singularity is not hot, not cold, not short, not long. A singularity is a pure process, a pure difference, a pure change. So what defines a singularity? Deleuze's answer is that a singularity is fully defined by what he calls differential relations. What is a differential relation? It means that a singularity is defined by its relations to neighboring singularities. It is nothing but its differing relations to other singularities. But these other singularities are also nothing but their relations to their neighboring singularities. That's abstract, but in other words, the problem with the virtual realm is that singularities are internal to their relations. Each singularity, right here and right now, is nothing but its relations to some other singularities. It cannot instigate change by itself because it is nothing but these relations to others. But the others can also not instigate change, again, because they are nothing but relations with others for whom the same is again true. So, even though Deleuze initially defined the virtual realm as a dimension of pure change, upon closer inspection, we find that these singularities that are supposed to populate it cannot change at all. And they cannot change because the virtual realm is defined by continuity. Not a single singularity has a private aspect that escapes its relations. Every singularity is fully continuous with its neighboring singularities, for whom the exact same thing is true. So for the reasons just covered, Deleuze starts to develop a second metaphysics starting in the logic of sense. Instead of a metaphysics of continuity between virtual singularities located in a separate ontological realm, this will be a metaphysics of discontinuity between entities with individual virtual essences that always remain completely separate from each other. Hence the title of my book, Against Continuity. And this brings me to Deleuze's second metaphysics. According to Deleuze's second metaphysics, reality does not contain two realms. It does not consist of two realms. All of reality is just one realm, which Deleuze sometimes calls the plane of immanence. Immanence here simply means that there is no further level of reality that grounds everything else, like a foundation, or that controls it, like a puppeteer. This immanent realm consists of entities that Deleuze calls machines or assemblages. He calls them machines because they operate. They add their own difference to reality rather than just being passive representations of others that do all the work. Every existing entity is such a machine. Hence, machines do not just include technical artifacts made by human beings, such as chainsaws and smartphones. They also include molecules, stars, festivals, religions, theories, zebras, rivers, and fantasies. Everything in reality is the result of productive relations among different constellations of such machines, whether we are talking about the processes that produce helium in stars, thoughts in human minds, or cars in factories. So, what is the metaphysical status or structure of such machines? These can be deduced from the principle of exteriority. if things are external to their relations, then every existing thing must have a dimension or a private interior beyond its engagements with its parts and its environment. Deleuze calls this dimension the body, or the body without organs of a machine. This body is not its physical, corporeal body. It is a body that withdraws itself from actual existence. It is a purely metaphysical entity. This, however, is not enough. If, in and of themselves, all things are bodies, then they must also be something else in order to prevent all bodies from being fully identical to each other. Each body must therefore also be defined by what Deleuze calls its desire, or, with less counterintuitive terms, its powers or capacities. A power is something that a body has thanks to its relations with its parts and its environment. But at the same time, a power cannot be reduced to these relations. Therefore, the principle of exteriority is not violated. For example, I have the power to speak English. I have this power thanks to certain relations with textbooks and teachers, thanks to certain relations between parts of my brain, my memories, and so on. All these are entities that generate, regenerate, and alter my power to speak English, but they are not this power itself, and they do not have this power. A textbook in English does not have the power to speak English. Instead, I have this power, even though I have it thanks to them. The same logic holds true for all things, which is to say for all machines. The metaphysically basic elements of reality are machines that are defined by a body of powers, which is to say by certain capacities that a machine has thanks to their relations with others, but that are not reducible to those relations. Now, a power need not always manifest itself. Water does not always have to boil, and the speakers of a certain language do not always need to speak it. When a power manifests itself to some other entity, however, it never does so directly. It never does so as that power itself. You are currently not experiencing my power to speak English. You are just experiencing some sentences in the English language. These testify to my capacity to speak English, but they are not this capacity itself. Likewise, when water boils, what manifests to us is a hot liquid that can burn our skin, but what manifests to us is not the power to boil itself. In other words, powers are virtual, but in a sense different from the virtual realm in difference and repetition, where everything was continuous. And when a power manifests, it does not present itself as such. Instead, it presents what Deleuze calls a partial object. A partial object is like a translation of a power. The world of actual entities that we experience is in its entirety an ever-changing landscape of manifestations of such powers. And as with the example of water, we never experience these powers directly. All that we experience are manifestations which testify to the existence of these capacities. Now, recall that one reason for Deleuze's earlier metaphysics of a virtual realm was that change and causation needed to be accounted for. We now have a second metaphysics in which there is no longer a virtual realm. We now have an ontology of machines, according to which each machine has its own private virtual interior, consisting of powers, fully surrounded by partial objects or manifestations that prevent direct contact between the powers of two different entities. Does this solve the problem of causality and change in a better way? In some sense, it does, and let's see how that works. Whenever a machine registers another machine, it registers this other entity in terms of a partial object. But which aspect of this machine registers the impact of this other entity? Where does this other leave a trace? Where does it leave its mark? Well, it leaves its mark on the powers of a machine. A person spends time with an English person, and as a result, their power to speak English increases. A mobile phone is equipped with a GPS tracker, and it thereby gains the power to make its location known. A steel tip is added to a wooden staff and thereby gives a weapon the power to pierce armor. A young animal watches and imitates its parents and thereby develops the power to hunt prey. Such examples testify to how the being in itself of machines is closed to being experienced by others. Others only ever register partial objects, but the being in itself of powers is open to experiencing others in terms of partial objects. These experiences directly impact and alter the powers that a machine is, which in turn means that a machine can start to manifest in different ways that are perhaps completely impossible before a certain encounter with another machine took place. This logic gives us causation and change, because powers are causes. Every entity only ever registers the world in terms of the powers that it has, or as Deleuze quips in Anti-Oedipus, the I interprets everything in terms of seeing. My powers are the cause of how I register other things. But as soon as I do register them, my powers can change as a result of this encounter, which in turn can change what I register in the world and how I can maneuver through it, which can lead me to having new experiences with new partial objects, which again can change my powers, and so on. This is another reason why Deleuze calls entities machines. Based on its powers, every entity moves through the world in ways that can change its powers, which can in turn instigate new moves, which can instigate new changes to powers, and so on. This is the sense of every entity operates. Finally, Deleuze's second metaphysics also accounts for why change and causation are not directly visible, not directly something we can isolate. The reason is that they are only partially or indirectly visible. Every causal connection in reality has two poles, two sides. One of those sides is a partial object, meaning that it is a manifestation of a certain power by a certain entity. Right now, the sentences that you are hearing me speak are such manifestations. This first pole is completely available to our experience, but the second pole, the second part of causation, is not. It consists of the powers of a receiving machine that is open to that specific kind of partial object. In this example, those powers are your powers to understand and speak a certain language, which will increase or decrease depending on your exposure to this language. But how much they increase or decrease is something not directly available to us. We can only come to know this indirectly by actualizing those powers into new English words and phrases. All this is why we can never isolate change and causation from among a series of actual events. The reason is that change and causation constantly dip into the virtual aspect of individual entities by generating, regenerating, or altering their powers that are then in turn actualized into new manifestations. This machinism, if you will, is a more concrete and ultimately more consistent account of reality than Deleuze's earlier metaphysics, which banished all change and causality to a wholly separate virtual realm, a realm that was supposed to warrant all of reality's dynamism, but that instead turned out to be the place where change could only freeze up permanently in the iron cage of internal relations. In conclusion, it is Deleuze's second metaphysics that ought to merit the bulk of our attention. The logic of sense and his later works are not a continuation of an earlier metaphysics that would remain unchanged for the rest of his career. Deleuze's early metaphysics was rejected and replaced with a more promising alternative. It is this ontology of machines or assemblages that, in my view, ought to be the central element of Deleuze's legacy. Thank you very much.
네, 강연 감사합니다. 이른 아침 시간인데 이렇게 강연 준비해 주셔서 감사합니다. 제가 이 책을 읽으면서도 풍부한 예시와 적절한 해설로 논의를 끌어가는 게 인상적이었는데요. 강연에서도 예시를 통해서 이해하기 쉽게 설명해 주신 것 같습니다. 오늘 강의는 이제 크게 3가지 줄기를 따라 강연을 전개해 주셨습니다. 차이와 반복에서 제시된 들뢰즈의 첫 번째 형이상학, 그리고 여기서 제시된 형이상학이 왜 실패했는지, 그리고 그 후 전개하는 들뢰즈의 2번째 형이상학에 대해서 그것을 어떤 핵심적인 그 논의들이 무엇인지에 대해서 강의를 해주셨습니다. 그러면 이제 그 2부 시간에는 이제 질의응답 시간이 진행이 될 텐데요. 조금 늦게 들어오셨던 분들을 위해서 그 2부 순서는 어떻게 진행되는지 간략하게 다시 한번 설명을 드리겠습니다. 저희가 그 질문은 이제 사전 신청할 때 그 미리 받기도 했었는데요. 지금 강연을 들으시면서 어떤 그 떠오르셨던 질문, 하고 싶었던 질문들을 2부가 시작하면 채팅창에 올려주시면 순차적으로 질의응답 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 또는 그냥 직접 그 발언으로 질문을 바로 해주시길 원하시는 경우에는 역시 채팅창에 그 발언을 신청해 주시면 그 순서에 따라서 발언권을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 그래서 질문을 하실 때에는 만일 영어로 해주시면 다시 이제 한국말로도 함께 그 질문을 동시에 해주시면 좋겠습니다. 그러면 이제 1부 강연 시간은 마치겠고요. 한 10분 정도 쉬었다가 2부 순서를 진행하겠습니다. 지금 시각이 42분인데요. 52분에 네, 52분 좀 애매한가요? 네. 55분에 뵙겠습니다. 55분에 다시 2부를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 그럼 잠시 후에 4시 55분에 뵙겠습니다.